Ads not read by me, Mary Payne, don't necessarily reflect the views of Pink Shade. If you'd like to listen to ad-free, you're going to go on over to Supercast or Patreon, and you can find the links to Pink Shade Prime at pinkshadepodcast.com. Hey y'all, welcome to Pink Shade. It's Mary Payne here, and today I have a great guest. It is Larrison Campbell of the podcast Witnessed, Devil in the Ditch. You guys, this is a great podcast I've told you about. I've told you to listen because I was having Larrison on, and I think last week it hit number 10 on the overall charts. And I don't mean like in your little crime chart or your reality TV chart. I'm talking like overall, like next up there, like to Smartless. Like, Larrison, how are you? I'm so excited for you.
Thank you, Mary Payne. I'm thrilled to be here. And if I may toot Devil in the Ditch's horn just a little bit,
Please.
we spent a month in the top 10, so we have
for sure.
But yes, that's my fun little promotional brag that I get to do.
You should. I mean, now, are you a first-time podcaster, or have you been involved with podcasts before?
I'm more or less a first-time podcaster. I used to work for a publication in Mississippi called Mississippi Today, or I should now say, as of last week, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Mississippi Today, which is
Ooh.
great. And I used to work on their politics podcast, so we'd kind of recap politics every week, state politics. But this is my first narrative podcast, and it's my first national one. So.
Now, are you, if you're working for Mississippi Today, but you live in New York, so are you doing it out of New York, or were you living in Mississippi a little bit?
Unfortunately, I had to leave 4 years ago when I moved to New York. They do like their local news reported by people who live there, so which I respect. But they're a great publication. If you're in Mississippi, your listeners who are in Mississippi, please check them out. Wonderful publication, and I'm thrilled that I did work there when I did.
Okay, and so now that you're in New York, but I mean, you're a journalist by trade, and are you now going to be fully in the podcast world? Are you working for a publication in New York?
I'm trying to be fully in the podcast world. It's just so much fun working on podcast, as I'm sure you know. Mm-hmm. But it's a really collaborative way of telling stories, and with the one that I just did, Devil in the Ditch, which was about my family, I feel like I've gotten a ton of credit for it because it's a story about people in my life. But the reality is, behind the scenes, I had a phenomenal team, story editor, a producer, a sound designer, and just this great group of people collaborating with me on it. And so what is normally, if you're writing for print, kind of a lonely process after you've finished all the interviews, this time, I was bouncing ideas off of people all the time and taking direction and taking notes. And it's a really fun way to work and a fun way to tell a story.
I did like the part of your podcast where you would kind of behind the scenes talk to your producer or whoever was traveling with you. Like, can you believe this? Can you believe that? I used to have a podcast that I started in 2018 called Pain in the Pod, where I only interviewed podcasters. And we just talked about their podcast and their process and how they came up with the story and how long it took. And so I feel that I'm a little bit of an expert in sort of how podcasts get made different than the one I do, which is just sit and talk about reality TV. Every so often have to cut something out, but that's it. It's just like easy breezy. So I know how much work it takes. So how long from idea to when it came out, how long did you work on it?
Oh, Lord. I mean, so from idea, it's funny, the idea kind of came to me sort of as an evolution over the last 5 years or so. It started when I was at Mississippi Today, and I was doing some research into crime statistics, and I happened to stumble across, if you've listened to the podcast, this statistic that gets repeated quite often, which is that 85% of the murders in my hometown of Greenville, Mississippi, have not been solved.
That's
and
huge.
In the last 20 years, which is, crazy when you compare it to say Mississippi statewide statistics, which are like around, I think it's like around 42% haven't been solved. That's similar to national, statistics.
Mhm.
And so, that alone struck me as worth writing about. But then I realized, oh, I actually have a personal I have a personal window into what it's like when you're one of those murders, when someone you love is a victim whose murder doesn't get solved. And
Wow.
so, I think I thought about writing that sort of as a long form story, and I
Mhm.
dug around on that for a little while, but it always felt a little bit bigger. And as you know well, when you're working with a story in the South, one of the most fun parts about it is all the accents.
Yeah.
And like a Prince story wasn't going to capture that. Like it just wasn't going to get
Yeah.
where it needed to go. And so I started thinking of it as an audio story, and I wound up pitching it about a year and a half ago, and was lucky that it sold fairly quickly. And we went into production in March of 2022 and finished in March of 2023. So it was a full year of basically just straight ahead reporting, interviews, writing, editing, rewriting, editing over and over and over again until the week before the podcast came out on April 1st.
Well, I listened to the whole thing, and because I have to watch, so much TV, and then I listen to a lot of reality TV podcasts as well for my job, sometimes these really great long form podcasts go by me. And so sometimes I'll ask the listeners, hey, have you guys listened to, I've got a road trip, or we're trying to get into a new one, and this one popped up because David, the hairdresser in Jackson, posted about it. And I'm friends with him on Facebook. He's a wonderful hairdresser in Jackson, and he posted about it. And I was like, oh, let me check that out. And then I saw like where it was on the charts. It was like a huge thing. It wasn't just like some like Podunk, Mississippi, like somebody in their, garage making a podcast. This was like a Campside Media, like a real one. And then I started listening. And then, of course, immediately I jump in like a stalker. I'm like, well, Larrison will have to be my friend now. I'm going to have to reach out, which is
I
what I
was
do.
so excited to get your message. I know it's
Well, I
funny.
was,
Oh, sorry.
no, you
Continue.
go ahead. It's funny.
I was
Go
just
ahead.
going to say it was funny. I was realizing, I think we set this date like 5 weeks ago,
Mhm, mhm.
and at the time it just seemed like the idea that, because the last episode comes out next week,
Yeah,
and that just kind of seemed like such an impossibility when you and I were talking about setting this date, and now it's actually here. The story is wrapping up. So
I know, and everybody has a subscriber service. We do. We have Pink Shade Prime, we do Patreon, Supercast, all that, and you guys have one called The Binge, and I think I just clicked it, and it was $4, maybe it was $3, but it was something inexpensive to listen to the whole thing. And then, so I did that because I drove to the beach by myself. So I had all this time in the car by myself, which is like a super luxury these days. So I listened to the whole thing. And then at the end, they recommended another one, which was about the boys that came out of the woods in Canada. And I was like, well, it's like, well, now I'm going to listen to this one. So, I mean, this is like a promo for The Binge. But I was like, I've already paid my $4, so I may as well listen to this
oh, yeah,
other one.
Gone Wild Boys is actually one of the only podcasts I've ever listened to twice. I loved it that much. I listened to it when it first came out, and then I
Uh-huh.
actually listened to it again when I was about to start writing this one, because the writing in that one, the narrator, Sam, is so funny and
Hmm.
he's so vivid, and he really captures this town and these kids. And it's just, I was like, I got to get some of that in my head
It's
as writing.
Well, I would say, you guys, if you want to like listen to the whole thing, there's one episode less. You can wait a week, but if not, you can click that The Binge. I just did it from. They make it so easy now to spend your $4 or whatever, but and then you get all these other ones to binge. So, which is
It only
it's danger.
benefits them, yeah.
It only benefits them, but it's also like bad for me because then I'll put it on, then like I won't go to sleep because I'm trying to finish the story. Now, okay, so you started this podcast and you said, okay, I'm gonna go to Mississippi, but you started with your dad because it was his mother. And to me, this is a tale of what many Mississippians feel, is that you leave Mississippi, but you never really leave. And I'm that way. Like I'm here with my sisters now. Like you live in New York, right? I live in the DC area, and you leave, but you never really leave. When you go home to Greenville and you can hear those accents and people are like, "Hey, Larrison," like you've always lived there. And so I love that part of the podcast of you kind of going in, and I love the table of knowledge or whatever it was and the
Love
ants.
those guys.
And so, all right. So let's talk about the Mississippi aspect. We have some great Southern names here. Okay. Your grandmother's Presh, perfect. And of course your name is Larrison. So there has to be a story behind why your name is Larrison. Like people
Yeah.
always are interested in why my name is Mary Payne. So let's hear it.
Yes. So I'm guessing the Payne is a family last name on your part, right?
George Payne Cosser is my grandfather. And then there's all the way down to the fourth, fifth on that. And then my dad only had girls, so they had to stick it in there somewhere. So they gave it to me.
See,
Yeah.
that's what a lot of people don't understand about, I feel like, Southern women who have double names. They're like, oh, Mary Claire, stuff like that. And I'm like, no, 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 that's actually not a real Southern way to do a double name. Real Southern way is woman's name first, family name second,
Yes.
last name.
Yes.
Yes. So my best friend growing up was Mary Winston. Another really good friend growing up, Ellen Douglas. My
Yep.
cousin. And so, yeah, you have, it's just this wonderful, and my name actually follows a very similar trajectory. So my first name, I was named for my grandmother on my mother's side, Aline Larrison. And so my first name is Aline. My Larrison is my mother's maiden name. So
Okay. I've always
like
tried to explain that. It's definitely a family name. I said, I'm like, Larison's definitely a family name. It's definitely a maiden name or a grandmother's name. It's somewhere it's a family last name that they gave you as a first name.
yes.
Okay. So, all right. Give me the short version of what happened with your grandmother for people who haven't listened. Give the short version of the murder of your grandmother. It's so hard to say the murder of your grandmother, but that is the story.
Yes, it
Yeah.
is. I know it is. It's always interesting having a conversation about this because I do feel like people, and understandably feel the need to say, I enjoyed your podcast. I'm so sorry about what happened to your grandmother. And I'm like,
Right.
thank you. But I think there are two ways when you spend a year working on something like this, there are two ways you see it, and I've sort of had to kind of separate in dealing with this podcast. I had to go into the emotion of it, but I also have had to kind of separate it out. So when I'm talking about the podcast, I don't really think about it in that emotional way. And so I can very easily tell you what happened, which was I was about a year out of college. It was the summer of 2003. And my grandmother, who at that time was a widow, had been a widow for 3 years, was going about her day and her typical fashion. The last phone call I think she made that morning was 8:30, and her sister Charlotte was trying to get a hold of her for most of the afternoon, and couldn't get her on the phone. And so around 4 o'clock, she went over to her house to check on her. And she found my grandmother's body on the floor of my grandmother's sun porch, sort of her back parlor area.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandmother had been murdered that day. They don't have an exact time, but she had been bludgeoned, hit in the head with what they later decided was likely a brass candlestick. And someone had covered her face with a dish towel. And the
Mm-hmm.
dish towel would wind up being a real talking point in my grandmother's murder because
Mm-hmm.
for reasons that, I take this with a grain of salt, but a lot of investigators tend to believe that covering the face of a murder victim is a sign of remorse on the part of the person who did the crime, who killed
Right.
the person. And so
Mm-hmm.
they assumed that it would then the person who killed her was somebody who knew her.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, my grandmother, and this kind of became the real trouble here, was that my grandmother had lived in Greenville all 85 years of her life. And she was very active in all areas of the community. And so when you try to sort of figure out who knew her, I mean, there were just hundreds of people who did. So
Mm-hmm.
it
Right.
really it didn't exactly narrow down the suspect list.
And she was very active in the community, and she volunteered at what's like it seems like a local boys and girls club type of thing, and tutored sort of underprivileged kids in the area that were likely all black. And then so in a town in the delta of Mississippi, you know, not the most progressive area. And so even in 2003, immediately it's like, well, I'm sure it was one of these black kids, and you and I have talked. There was a murder in my family 50 years ago or so. No, more than that, 60 years ago. And same idea. It's like, well, I'm sure it was a yard guy, a black guy. And you're like, well, why were you just assuming that, Um, and that sort of is a little bit of a trope that you get in this podcast is, well, I'm sure that's what it was, because nobody kind of wanted to look closer, which it turned out there was somebody closer that became a suspect.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why, if you have listened to Devil in the Ditch, you will have heard the story of that family murder, of your family murder.
Mm-hmm.
And because there really are a lot of similarities there. And there are a lot of similarities there because I think that is what happens, outside the Deep South, but particularly in the Deep South. And particularly when a white woman is murdered, is that
Mm-hmm.
sort of the blame, whether or not there's an actual person to point a finger at, tends to fall on this trope of the black man. And so my grandmother, they looked at her yardmen. They looked at, and the place where she was tutoring was actually a juvenile detention center. And so
Okay.
um, I don't know if they wound up seriously looking at any of the kids she had worked with there, but that certainly was spoken about as, a potential risk factor. And
Yeah.
because of that, and because it was so unusual for an older white woman, to work in that community, they almost talked about her. The investigators talked about her as though she, had lived what they kind of deemed a quote high risk lifestyle.
For volunteering to tutor children. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
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 So,
Oh,
but I think there
well,
is, you kind of people, I think it feels safe to be able to blame a victim
hmm
and to say, oh, well, they did something I would never do. And that's why this happened to them. And that's
right.
another reason to do that, that people tend to look in that area and follow that trope. Because if you do look closely, you see that perhaps the reason they got killed was not because of anything that they did.
Oh, right. Yeah. She
Yeah.
wasn't, yeah, out slinging heroin on the corners of Greenville.
Right.
Um, so Presh had a sister, Charlotte. Now, were they the only two children, or was there another
They have an
two sisters?
they had an older brother, and he was, I believe, 2 years older than my grandmother. And they were very close with him too, but he passed away about 15 years before Presh did.
Okay. And then Charlotte lives in town, and they were close, but it seems when you're telling the story, it seems that the two of them had some sort of sibling rivalry, and it seems that Charlotte was always felt like what we call in our family baby sister in the back, because like me, I was the baby sister, and they'd always put me in the back seat. And so in our family, we always say baby sister in the back. So Charlotte felt like baby sister in the back, and she seemed to be very sort of negative towards Presh. Like, you told a story of somebody's wedding where Presh had such a great time, danced all night on the dance floor, had a ball. And then Charlotte would say things like, well, I was really always the best dancer. And like, and it seems like a lot of these little things where I love my sister, but I'm a better dancer. That kind of thing. She always felt that Presh got the spotlight and she didn't. And then you add into the story Charlotte's son, Richard, who by all accounts from you telling it, just growing up, he seemed a little bit, maybe he didn't fit in, or he was a little bit of a misfit. And so that immediately makes him a suspect in this murder because he was a little weird. So how do you navigate? I'm going to go home, and I'm already like New York City, I'm already like a city girl, and I'm gonna go back in, I'm gonna try to talk about it. And how do you navigate? Now I'm gonna try to talk to my cousin Richard about if he murdered my grandmother. Like, that's rough.
It is. And I really didn't know how to approach it with him and with my great aunt, his mother.
Hmm.
And they were the first interviews I did for this podcast. And the reason was because my great aunt was at the time 101 years old, and
101.
101. And she and her son Richard, who had never really moved out of the house, were still living together. And so, and as things happen in the South, I've seen her many, many times over the years. I've seen him over the years since my grandmother's murder. We've never brought it up. Like, we've never talked about it.
Of
So,
course not. You wouldn't ever talk about it. Goodness.
no.
Mm-mm.
And certainly not talk about the suspicion that, had sort of fallen on Richard over the years. Even though some of the biggest people who had suspected him were, my aunts and for a time my father.
Hmm.
And so we both knew this, but we just never brought it up. And so when I went to sit down with her, I really didn't know how I was going to work my way up to it. I thought, okay, we've got 2 days we're going to spend with them. Maybe I'll talk about the family on the first day, and then by the second day, like, I can really get into it with her. Um, but it turns out, as soon as I brought up my grandmother,
Hmm.
um, she did go. I think my aunt Charlotte really came by her resentment of my grandmother very honestly.
Hmm.
She really was sort of the forgotten child in that family, and my grandmother had been the star.
Yeah.
And that trend did persist, as you said, through the years.
Yeah.
And so when I brought up my grandmother, my great aunt made a snarky comment about how she was the queen, and then immediately segued into finding my grandmother's body.
All right, y'all. I know you've heard me talking about microdosing. Okay. Microdosing is what lots and lots of people are doing to feel better, and then you can get so many health benefits. Let me tell you what microdosing helps you with. Okay. Creative boost, enjoying the moment, sleep. That's for me. Pain, also me. Everybody knows I've got this back pain, anxiety. I mean, at this point, everybody has anxiety. Am I right? Workout and recovery, and I've even heard it helps with sex. So, what I've been using the microdosing gummies for are for sleep because my mind just runs and runs and runs. So, what I've been doing is I've been biting one of these gummies in half about, I don't know, 45 minutes, an hour before I'm ready to go to bed. And by the time I'm ready to lay down and sort of read my book and go to sleep, I'm able to fall asleep without the hamster wheel of my mind not shutting off. It's really been great for me. It helps me fall asleep, helps me wake up rested. Last night I slept for 8 hours. It's a total and complete miracle. And I've tried everything, guys. I've really tried everything. I know that producer Ingrid has also been taking them at night for sleep, and she has really been reporting to me some wonderful benefits for her nighttime anxiety and sleep as well. So, microdose THC gummies are available nationwide. To learn more about microdosing THC, go to microdose.com and use code PINKSHADE to get free shipping and 30% off your first order. You guys, they have all sorts of gummies, all sorts of flavors, and they taste really good as well. So the links can be found in the show notes, but again, that's microdose.com and use code PINKSHADE and let me know how it's working for you. Hey, y'all, do you ever wish you had visibly thicker hair? How about less shedding of your hair? Maybe stress is causing your hair to thin, or is it the other way around? Do you have stress because of your thinning hair? There are multiple root causes of hair thinning, and Nutrafol addresses key root causes through a whole body approach to hair health. Millions of Americans experience thinning hair. It's not only common, it's totally normal, but among women, it's not really openly talked about. And if you're going through it, you might feel lonely or frustrated or, again, stressed. So you can join the thousands of women that are doing something about it, including me with Nutrafol. Nutrafol is the #1 dermatologist recommended hair growth supplement, clinically shown to improve visible thickness and strength. I have gotten my Nutrafol, and my husband has gotten his Nutrafol, and we have been taking it. They come in these really sleek black bottles that we just leave right on our counter. Gorgeous. So you're going to go to Nutrafol.com and take their hair health wellness quiz. You're going to identify the causes of your thinning hair, and Nutrafol is going to give you a personalized plan for better hair growth, because they treat it from, like, if you're like perimenopause or if you just had a baby, there's all sorts of root causes for this. And again, sometimes stress is the cause. So take the first step to visibly thicker, healthier hair. For a limited time, Nutrafol is offering our listeners $10 off your first month subscription and free shipping when you go to Nutrafol.com and enter promo code PINKSHADE. Find out why over 4,000 healthcare professionals recommend Nutrafol for healthier hair. Nutrafol.com, spelled Nutrafol.com, promo code PINKSHADE, Nutrafol.com, promo code PINKSHADE.
And so that very naturally became that topic of conversation for the next 2 days.
But in that first interview, is that when Richard, you had a producer with you, a guy,
Yes.
and Richard in the other room just immediately started in, and I know why y'all are here, and got kind of like snarky, like right away. And he was like, we're not here to accuse you of anything, like what? And it just sort of like was a parallel conversation going on. And you didn't know about that in the other room.
I didn't.
Yeah.
And that was later. That was a little later, but that was that
Okay.
first day. It was that afternoon. And I had gone, I think, to talk about, just to look at some old photos with my great aunt,
Yeah.
in her back den, and Richard and yes, our male producer were out in the front. And yeah, the conversation quickly became very contentious between the two of them. It was a really, really uncomfortable conversation.
Um, Total sidebar. I'm concerned about the house, and has it been cleaned out of the hoarding situation? I was
No,
very
he's
worried about that.
so that's another thing. Yeah, my cousin Richard does not throw things away. And so when I went to visit, this house that I'd grown up spending, every Easter at, lots of
Mm-hmm.
Thanksgivings there, weekend nights, I'd sleep over there because my great aunt Charlotte, unlike my grandmother, she didn't have her own grandchildren. And
Mm-hmm.
so we really were her default grandchildren.
Right.
And she And so over the years, though, as she was 101 by the time I came to visit, she really hadn't been mobile for a decade before that. So sorry.
It's okay. Usually there's a dog barking in my podcast, because they're not here with me, so they're not barking.
There was a time when I could put him in his crate and he would be wonderful. And he has learned that he doesn't like being in the crate in the daytime, and he just barks even more. So I
Mm.
just hope that I can stay on his good side. But
Okay, the hoarder house. That's what we're talking about.
yes.
I'm worried about it.
So over the years, though, the upkeep of the home fell on Richard, and Richard is, he hoards things. He doesn't throw
Mm-hmm.
things away. And so when I went to visit, the kitchen wasn't navigable. The dining room wasn't navigable. There were bags and bags. She'd had him clean up, but he wouldn't throw things out. So there were like 4 giant black trash bags just stuffed to the brim and scattered about. And I suspected that after we left, he would just take the contents out of the trash bag and put it back where it had been. And
Yeah, right.
so after she passed away last summer, and he's still in that house, and I suspect he is probably the only person who enters that house these days. I
Mm-hmm.
just don't think anybody else is able to.
It's it's interesting about the evidence in the case, because when you listen to sort of a true crime story, you're always hoping for a resolve, or like some smoking gun, or it's going to be, there's plenty of podcasts that have broken stories and solved cases. And in the case of this one, you're looking at the evidence there. So to me, the biggest evidence is the covering of the face. That you just have to watch two datelines to know that that's a thing. That would mean something. So it points to somebody that knew her, but in the case with her being such all over different areas of the community, that doesn't help. And then with Richard, his fingerprints were found on a couple of drawers where the dishcloth was, but then he was in the house all the time. According to them, he was in the house all the time, helping her fix her dishwasher or changing a light bulb, or as a good nephew would do, right? With an elderly, aunt, he would go over and help her. But then at the same time, people said, like, that's not true. He wasn't over there all the time helping her. Like, Richard and Charlotte didn't even like her. So you don't know if he was over there all the time and if a fingerprint can stay on a drawer for weeks at a time because all the evidence wasn't collected at the time. And then there's really nothing you can do about that at this point because all the evidence is gone, all the time has passed, and some evidence was even destroyed in Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And so it's sort of like, what do you do now? Like, how do you as family members sit with it knowing what you know and just sit with it knowing like it's probably never going to be solved unless somebody confesses, right?
I mean, I really did want to go. I really went into this with this idea that it's been 20 years almost.
Yeah.
I should be able to, with all these resources, should be able to get the police file, find something that wasn't followed up on, and like really actually answer this question of what happened to my grandmother. And that was a huge priority to me. And very quickly, it became clear that, as you said, someone's going to need to confess
Hmm.
for this to be solved because there just isn't evidence. I do agree. Like that fingerprint is interesting. It's far from a smoking gun because whether or not you believe that, he was over there all the time, if he'd been over there once and opened up
Right.
or once in 6 months, that fingerprint could have stayed there.
Right.
And it's likely he was over there once in 6 months.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so you do, I mean, the story very quickly to me became not solving this, but really this question, sort of more of a meditation, really, on like what makes a suspect, what makes someone, what makes someone look quote guilty, and
Hmm. Right.
what do you do when you can't figure out if your instincts are right? Like,
Hmm.
how do you like live with that? And I think everybody in my family, I think, has a different answer to this. Two of the people I spend a lot of time talking to are my dad's sisters. He has an older sister and a younger sister.
Yeah.
And they both have very different takes on what happened to my grandmother from my dad and from different from the one that I have. Mine is very gray area. I have some thoughts, but I really, I'm a journalist. Like I need more to really believe something.
Yeah.
And both of my aunts are really, really convinced that Richard is guilty of this and that he needs to confess or they need to do a trial on circumstantial evidence. And I think for them, that is peace. Like, I think
Mm.
believing that they know this and that they have an answer is a level of peace for them. For me, I think really coming to the understanding that I don't know and that I might never know, but really answering that for myself, which is to say, answering that I'm not going to get an answer for myself,
Yeah.
I think was deeply satisfying for me. And
Yeah.
understanding why I'm not going to get an answer was really satisfying. And so,
Well, I want to talk about your aunts. So they seem like my people. They're total like citizen detectives. They have folders. They have collected all their information. And you did get some information from them that you didn't get because what we didn't say is that the Greenville police will not give you the police report. And you can't file a FOIA. You can't do anything. They're like, it's an open case and you can't have it. So what do you think is in there that would help you? Do you know what I mean? Because if I feel like your aunts pretty much have it all. I feel like they have every piece of information.
So there is something very interesting that is supposedly in that police file. Because as you mentioned, there were fingerprints that were found on a drawer.
Hmm.
And the fingerprints that were found on this one drawer is a tool drawer, and the tool drawer had nothing to do with my grandmother's murder.
Right.
There was no direct link, but another we had a private investigator. My family hired a private investigator, and that private investigator says that in the police file, when he looked at that police file back in 2004, there was another set of fingerprints that for some reason weren't recorded by the crime lab. So, take that with a grain of salt. But that there were another set of fingerprints that tied to the dish towel drawer. And as we've discussed, that dish towel was a part of her murder and
Hmm.
the aftermath of it. And he believes that my cousin Richard's fingerprints were on that dish towel drawer. And he swears it up and down, but I have evidence sheets, and I have the evidence sheets from the crime lab, and there's mention of fingerprints in like an envelope that the crime
Hmm.
lab received, but there's no more detail than that. And so it's just like, yeah, it'd be nice to look at the police file and find out if there are fingerprints in there that were pulled from that drawer. Again, I don't know that fingerprints on that dish towel drawer are a smoking gun. He says if he
Right.
left fingerprints there, I asked him about it, and Richard says if he left fingerprints there, it's because he was over at her house and washed his hands and dried them off. Makes perfect sense. But that is a little bit more information. And, there's other evidence that was collected. There were shoe prints. And I
Right.
don't really know. I know what the shoe prints that were collected look like, but I don't know what they collected several pairs of shoes from him, and I don't know what those shoes are. And they, said that those prints, the prints that they collected were too partial to match. But, technology is different now. I wonder if
Right.
perhaps 20 years later, if they could provide a match, they could make a match out of it.
Right.
So,
And
and
then, Richard probably still has the shoes because he keeps everything.
oh no, they they didn't. I don't think they gave them back. But yeah, if they gave them back, I guarantee you they're in that house. Guarantee it.
uh, well, what about, so how did the PI get to look at the police file if they won't let you look at it?
So things were different, I think, 18 years ago. The PI that my family hired had been a Greenville police detective. And then he wound
Okay.
up going on to run the Mississippi State Crime Lab. Like he was about as well respected in investigations as anybody in the state of Mississippi.
Yeah. Okay.
And
I remember now you talking to him on the podcast. Okay. Yes. Yes.
and so I think the police trusted him to look at it. And I think at that time they were a year into the investigation and no progress had been made. And I think they were frustrated too. And maybe they were also overwhelmed and understaffed, and they thought, yeah,
Yeah.
this will be helpful. And so it sounds like he got good cooperation from them. But, I think we're 6 police chiefs out from that administration in 2000,
Wow.
2004. And I actually don't fully understand why they wouldn't, again, six police chiefs out, large turnover on staff, I'm sure, in 20 years. I don't really know why they wouldn't want to give me the police file. And when I first spoke to the police chief about it, when I started the investigation, he seemed game. He seemed interested in helping me out with that. And
Hmm.
then when we put in the request, we couldn't even get an inventory of the file. And, I don't know. I don't know if maybe the file was hard for them to locate, harder than they expected. I don't know
Oh,
if certain things maybe weren't in the file that were supposed to be in the file. I don't know. I just
maybe one more police chief later, they'll let you do it. It's like, wait
I
for the
know.
next one.
I should just file. I should just put in a request every 18 months or so.
Right. Because you're like, who knows who might be working the desk? They might say yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I wonder why it is like that in Greenville specifically with such a high rate of unsolved crime. I wonder when that's so different than the state as a whole or the national average.
It is really interesting to me. And, one of the things I I spoke to a couple of people who live in Greenville about this. And there really is a sense that it is sort of the police have a certain suspect they look for, a certain type of suspect they
Mhm,
immediately gravitate to.
mhm,
And if if a murder doesn't fit that profile, um, I don't know that if a suspect doesn't fit that profile, I don't know that they're as good at investigating that.
mhm,
And I also think that there is sort of a sense, and I don't know if it's something that has happened just gradually over the years. I mean, I do think that they are understaffed, but I think
right,
understaffing happens everywhere.
for
But
sure.
I think that there tends to be, the people I spoke to who live in Greenville now, and this is across race lines, said that there's just this real feeling that the police kind of don't care, that they sort of feel like it's beyond them, that
Mhm,
there's more, that they can't really do anything about it and they sort of throw up their hands. One guy told me that he had three friends who'd been murdered and all three of those murders were unsolved, even though he
mm.
had a pretty good feeling that he knew who committed them.
Ah, that's terrible.
Yeah, three separate homicides. So,
And that person is walking around, and you're like, hope,
yeah.
yeah, that's well, I want to ask you, going back to your aunt, that towards the end of the podcast, there's a story that they tell about sort of like a trial that they put your cousin Richard on. They all sat around and tried to get him to confess.
Yes.
That didn't go so well, and obviously he did not confess. But I guess the whole theory is that her whole life Charlotte had this grudge against her sister and is very close to her only child, and they live together and do everything together. And then he's protective of his mother, and all these years heard Charlotte talking about how Presh was the queen and she was baby sister in the back. And then he just decided one day he couldn't take it anymore because he'd been overbilled for a wedding brunch, and he was just going to go kill her. That's the theory, right? And I was talking to my mom and my sisters about this before we got on, and I think my mother said, "Well, what would be the reason he would go over there and kill her?" Because she hasn't listened to it. And I said, "Well, as you know, when you're throwing a wedding for somebody and a brunch or a shower or whatever, if you're a couple," so I said, so I was telling my mom, I said, so Dave and I would get charged $100, Finney and her husband $100, Tay and her husband $100, but then the single people would each be also charged $100 to give the party. And then your name would appear on the invitation. David and Mary Payne Gilbert, Finney and Jimmy Moore, and then, just Bufkin Moore, like single. And I said, so Richard thought he and his mother should be charged as a couple. Everybody else was getting charged as a couple. So why were they having to pay 100 each instead of 100 as a couple, 50 each? So I'm explaining to my mother that goes, well, no, because he's a single. My mother just immediately was like, no, he's a single, so he has to pay as a single, and Charlotte's a single, and she pays as a single. I said, right, but you could see his point of why does he have to pay double when everybody else is only paying half to be on the invitation? But this is such a Southern conversation, and it sounds so ridiculous when you're saying it. But my mother immediately didn't say it's ridiculous. No, absolutely not. He's a single. He should pay 100, and then the couples each pay 100. I said, well, that was the crux of what he was mad about that day.
I mean, look, I'm kind of with your mom on this. I have to say, I think it goes down to lines. And so if your name is on the same line as somebody else, so,
Mm-hmm.
Mr. and Mrs., um,
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy Moore, say, Mr. and
Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Jimmy Moore, sure, that's great. Or Dr. and Mrs. Jimmy Moore.
Right.
They're on the same line. But if you are Richard X and Mrs., you know,
Yeah.
then you're on two separate lines. Like you're not a couple. You can't do a, Mr. and Mrs. when you're not married. You're on two separate lines. So I think you have to be billed separately. It's not even so much a household rate. I mean,
Yeah.
again, going to the Southern etiquette thing, as it is, as it is sort of a line by line rate.
I just think that it's such, when you're explaining it, it's such a Southern thing. And I'm listening to it going, yeah, oh, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
And there's so many people living up in Northern Virginia, which, to me is like, I may as well live in New York City. It's like very different than the Deep South, but it is technically the South Virginia. But people just don't have, 4 parties before a wedding, and you just don't have, 6 baby showers, or you just, that's just not done. People get married and they may have one wedding shower where like everybody comes and it's a party, but there's not then the kitchen shower maybe, and then there's around the house shower, and then they just don't do that. So when you think about any other part of the world, people listening to it would be like, why would you even pay $100 to give a party? Just put some burgers in the backyard. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to people that don't come from that way of life.
And there,
So
oh,
it
sorry.
does sound ridiculous to somebody in the outside world to be like, well, he and his mom did live in the same house. Maybe they should have each paid $50. But it just sounds so like picky that you wouldn't go over and kill somebody over it, But in the South, maybe you would.
I mean, that's the thing. And that is one of the many, many things. I really believe that every story you tell is very tied to the place where it's set. And I think
Mm-hmm.
this story is a perfect example of this because, regardless of why my grandmother was killed, it couldn't have happened this way in any other part of the country. This is such a Southern story. And, the idea that somebody within the family would do it, and the way everybody would sort of silently suspect that person. And of course, the motive that they would ascribe to this, which is the etiquette around a wedding brunch. I mean, that just, you don't hear a lot of those stories happening,
Mm-hmm.
in South Boston.
Right. Oh my gosh. Well, we have touched on the fact that there is a murder in my family that, of course, because you just don't talk about such things, we don't talk about it much, but you and I are going to talk about it separately. We're going to put it over on Patreon and Supercast. So we're going to wrap up, and then you and I are going to talk separately about that, because it's, when you think of this like Southern Gothic, I really don't ever really know how to explain it to people. Like, you can't explain what happens in the South with these characters. We love a character, and somebody could be the weirdest weirdo, but you could, well, he's such a character. And you're like, but is he such a character that could have gone over and killed his aunt? Is that the kind of character he was? Like, well, I don't know. You never know about people. Anyway, then they just move on. It's just like, what? So we're going to go separately and talk about that. But I want you to tell, as we wrap up, I want you to tell all the listeners where they can find out more about the podcast, where they can find out more about you, where they can follow you, and all that jazz.
Wonderful. Yes. So the podcast is called Witnessed, Devil in the Ditch. It's season 4 of a series called Witnessed. Definitely check out the other seasons too. You can get it on Apple Podcast. We're on Spotify, and I believe Stitcher. Anywhere you get a podcast, you can find
Right.
us. And please follow me on social media. I'm at This Is Larrison on both Instagram and Twitter. And
That's cute.
thank you. Larrison Campbell was too many characters, unfortunately. So I had to, and somebody else grabbed Larrison, which, you would not think is a super coveted one, but being a
Huh.
family name, I know somebody else, I think, with the last name just got to it first. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, nobody's trying to take Mary Payne, because who would be named that?
that's so fantastic.
Well, everybody, I'm going to tell y'all, please listen to season 4, Witnessed, Devil in the Ditch. And it's Campside Media, which if you follow podcasts, they're super reputable and always put out the best podcasts. So please, y'all, go listen. It's great. 7 episodes are out now, and a new episode, the final one, comes out next week. And y'all can DM me and let me know if y'all think Cousin Richard did it. And Larrison, I'll talk to you soon.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for having me on.